The focus of this lecture is Europe in the early Middle Ages, 600 to 1000, or we could say Europe in the early medieval period, 600 to 1000. The Frankish kingdom was established in the 500s AD by the Franks. Let's note here that to the Romans, the Franks or the French were called the Gauls. Their homeland was called Gaul. So France, the Frankish kingdom, had come under control of Rome thanks to Julius Caesar. You may remember that discussion of the Gallic Wars from 58 to 50 BC. So when the western half of the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Roman troops had been pulled out of and withdrawn from France, or the Roman territory of Gaul. With the Roman withdrawal from Gaul, the Franks were able to seize control of their homeland to reestablish their control over it. They took over a Roman fort called Paris and made it their capital. So in the 500s AD, we have the establishment of the Frankish kingdom in modern-day France, or the old Roman province of Gaul. The first king of the Frankish kingdom, or we could say the first king of France, was Clovis, who reigned as the king of France, the king of the Franks, from 481 to 511. Clovis is important because he unified the Franks under his leadership. He was the sole tribal chieftain. In other words, there were no more multiple gangs or tribes of Franks roaming from place to place in Gaul. All of the Franks were unified into one tribe of Frankish people under the leadership of one leader, one king named Clovis. Clovis also experienced a conversion to Christianity and then required that the Franks become Christians. He also established the first ruling family of France called the Moravian dynasty, or as they are nicknamed by historians, the Do-Nothing Kings. Clovis was a man of action, as we can see. He unified the Franks, was the first king of France, Christianized the Franks, but his heirs and successors, that is to say his sons and grandsons, were not really interested in working hard as kings. This is why historians call them the Do-Nothing Kings. After Clovis, the heirs and successors to the Moravian dynasty, who become the kings of France, established a political system or system of government which allows them, the kings of France, to have the title, the power, the glory, the influence of being the king of France, but to do none of the work associated with the job. So, standing at the top of France and the Frankish kingdom was the Moravian king, or Do-Nothing King, interested in having the title, the power, the influence, but not doing the day-to-day governing and management of the Franks. This was left to a man called the mayor of the palace. And the mayor of the palace position was hereditary, just like the king of France was a hereditary position passed from father to son, so was the mayor of the palace. So, the kings of France in the early medieval period came from a family known as the Moravian family or dynasty. The mayors of the palace came from a family known as the Carolingian family. Carolingian is Latin French for the family of Charles. So, the mayor of the palace was the man who did all of the work. He did the job of king. It was his responsibility to make sure that France was governed and ran efficiently. The mayor of the palace was helped with his job by three groups: scribes, who kept records for the mayor of the palace; accountants, who Now, we shouldn't think these are like CPAs who are doing tax records. It's not what we mean by accountants here. Accountants were men who were employed to come up with ways to tax the French people, new taxes, to collect those taxes, to levy the taxes, to keep up with how much money had been collected through taxes, to balance that money in a budget, and to provide it to the mayor of Paris for his various projects. The mayor of the palace was also aided by lawyers. Here again, we shouldn't envision lawyers in suits with briefcases going into trials. That's not what we mean at all. The word lawyer here is used very loosely. Lawyers, quote unquote, in early France were men who wrote the laws, made the laws, enforced the laws. They were like the law enforcement of France. They were the legal system. They were the ones who wrote the laws and enforced the laws and punished lawbreakers. The mayor of the palace was also aided by wealthy land-owning individuals in France called dukes, and by individuals who were also wealthy landowners called counts, but were not wealthy enough to be dukes. So the mayor of the palace had a lot of people at his disposal to work for him. This situation worked beautifully from the early 500s to the early 700s. So for about 200 years, you have these Moravian kings who do nothing, and Carolingian mayors of the palace who do all of the work for the King of France. This situation starts to change a little during the reign of Charles Martel from 714 to 741 as the mayor of the palace. This means that he does all of the work for the king of the Moravian dynasty and yet does not have the title king. Charles Martel is simply mayor of the palace. He does all of the work but doesn't have the glory of the title of king. In 732, the Frankish kingdom had a problem. And that is, in 732, a group of people called the Muslims invaded Frankish territory. The Muslims grew out of a religious sect in Saudi Arabia. In the 600s, there was a man by the name of Muhammad who was a practicer of traditional polytheism in Saudi Arabia, but he began to hallucinate and have revelations which were recorded into what was called the Quran. And essentially what Muhammad was able to do in a short time period was to convert the people of Saudi Arabia from their traditional polytheism to a religion he called Islam, which means submission to God or Allah. So at Muhammad's death, the Muslims had been taught by Muhammad that the way to achieve heavenly reward was to die in jihad, spreading the faith of Islam as far as one could take it. So after Muhammad's death, the Muslims had spread out through North Africa, and he had even attacked the Byzantine Empire and had tried to take it over with no success. But they had amassed a large amount of territory in North Africa for themselves, and by this point had pushed up into Spain, conquered the Visigoths, the original inhabitants of Spain, and took it over. The next logical step would be to move north into France. So as the Muslims in jihad or holy war push into France, Charles Martel has to put together an army and ride out to meet this threat. Why not the Moravian king? Because he does nothing. This is the job of Charles Martel, to defend the Franks. So in 732, at the Battle of Poitiers, the Muslims are defeated by Charles Martel. And many of the Franks, of course, are so thrilled with the fact that they've kept the Muslims out of France that they want some sort of special reward or award bestowed on Charles Martel. And some of his soldiers, some of his supporters, some of the men who had fought with him said, "You know, Charles Martel, you should be the King of France. You're doing the work. You have saved us from the Muslims. We're free. We've kept them to the south. You deserve recognition. Why not stage a rebellion against the Moravian king? We'll help you. We'll support you." But Charles Martel refused and said no. He was satisfied with being just mayor of the palace. So he continued his reign, doing all of the work of the King of France without the title. When Charles Martel died in 741, he left the title, Mayor of the Palace, to one of his sons. That son was succeeded by his brother. So, not to complicate things here, but Charles Martel leaves the title Mayor of the Palace to one son. That son dies, so another son steps in. So this son is Pippin III, reigns as the Mayor of the Palace from 751 to 768. He was known as the Short. And I'll just go ahead and point out here to you that the Franks had a tendency to nickname their political leaders in an ironic fashion. So Pippin III was called the Short, even though he was extremely tall for the time period, about 6 feet tall or maybe a little bit taller than that. It's sort of like today, you know how sometimes we'll call a really big guy tiny? Well, the Franks like to give ironic nicknames. So Pippin III, or Pippin the Short, was actually tall. He was a son of Charles Martel, second to gain the title of Mayor of the Palace from the father. So Pippin III reigns as Mayor of the Palace from 751 to 768. But unlike his father, Charles Martel, Pippin III is not satisfied with being just the Mayor of the Palace. He is a man of extreme ambition. He writes a letter to Pope Zacharias, the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, the most powerful man in all of Western Europe. Remember, at this point, the popes are also political leaders, attempting to provide some sort of unity and stability throughout Europe. Pippin sends a letter to Pope Zacharias, and he says, "Look, you know the situation up here in old Roman Gaul, in France, in the Frankish kingdom. My family, since 511, has acted as mayor of the palace, and we've had, since 511, these do-nothing kings. And what do you think about it? What would you suggest that we do here in this situation?" Pope Zacharias wrote back and said something to the effect that he who holds the power should hold the crown, or he who does the work should have the title. So if you understand those words, essentially what Pope Zacharias is saying is, you're doing the job of king, you should have the title of king. So Pippin III took this as papal approval to stage a rebellion against the do-nothing kings. So he presented this note from Pope Zacharias to the current reigning Moravian king, and he says, "Look, we can go to war here, and I'm sure I'm going to defeat you because people have been saying here in France forever that my father should have been king, that you all do nothing, so what's it going to be? You want a war? You want to step down? What you want to do?" The last Moravian king did nothing. He gave up his crown without a fight and became a monk instead. So Pippin III becomes, in 751, King of France. The Moravian dynasty is over. The Carolingian line of kings now starts in France. Pippin III assumed control of France as the King of France in 751. Pope Zacharias, unfortunately, died and was replaced by a pope named Stephen. Pope Stephen sent a message to Pippin III, and he said, the papacy needs your help. Let me remind you that if it had not been for our moral support, you would not be King of France. So we scratched your back, now scratch ours. We have a problem with invasions from a group of Germanic people called the Lombards. Please help us. They're taking over Rome. At one point, Pope Stephen was actually captured by the Lombards and suffered some physical mutilation as a result. So Pope Stephen asked for help. Pippin III knew he had no choice as a Christian but to help the Pope. So he took an army down into Rome and drove out the Lombards, defeated them, and gave the city of Rome and its surrounding territory back to Pope Stephen. This is known as the donation of Pepin. What Pepin has donated here, Pepin or Pippin, his name is pronounced and spelled two different ways. So the donation of Pepin is essentially the land that was owned by Pope Stephen given back to him, freed from the Lombards. This area eventually comes to be called the Papal States. When Pippin III died in 768, he was succeeded by his son, Charlemagne, who reigned from 768 to 814. Charlemagne translates from French as Charles the Great. Charlemagne, of course, inherits from his father, Pippin III, or Pepin the Short, the title King of France. Charlemagne does not have to fight to become the King of France. Instead, he can concentrate or focus on something else. So he does. What he concentrates on is making French territory bigger. So from 768 to 814, Charlemagne wages 54 separate military campaigns to expand his empire. In all of these campaigns, he only loses once, and he forbade by law anyone to ever mention that loss. But where he experienced trouble was on the border between France and Spain. And you'll remember, as we said just a moment ago, the Muslims control Spain and have established a kingdom there. So Charlemagne had attempted to take this area in between Spain and France away from the Muslims and had failed to do that. That area was called the Spanish March. Charlemagne conquers a huge amount of territory in Western Europe that includes parts of modern-day Germany in addition to France. He also had some relations with what were called tributary peoples in Eastern Europe. These were individuals who paid him tribute and stayed loyal to him, but were not necessarily a part of his empire. Charlemagne's conquest took him into the city of Rome. He conquered northern Italy and was marching into Rome, no doubt to conquer it as well. And it just so happens that he ends up in Rome on 12/25/800. This is an extremely important date. On 12/25/800, Charlemagne and his army marched into the city of Rome. When he entered into the city of Rome, the Pope asked Charlemagne if he would like to come to Mass. If you're not Catholic, you may not know this, but Catholics don't quote-unquote go to church. Catholics attend Mass. So on 12/25/800, a Mass was being held for Christ. This was known as Christ's Mass, or Christmas is what we call it now, a celebration of Christ's birthday. So on 12/25/800, Charlemagne was about to invade the city of Rome. To sort of cut him off and spare damage to the city of Rome, the current pope asked Charlemagne to attend a Mass for Christ, or to attend Christmas worship. at the church, the cathedral there in Rome. So on 1225-800, Charlemagne goes into the church there at Rome for church services. During the services, the Pope, Leo, invites Charlemagne to step to the front of the church and places a crown on the head of Charlemagne, or is about to. Legend tells us that Charlemagne snatched the crown away from the Pope and placed it on his own head. So there's a lot of important stuff going on here. Charlemagne was about to invade Rome. The Pope intervened and gave Charlemagne what Charlemagne was there for, which was control over Rome. He spared the city of Rome invasion and takeover, pillaging, by simply placing a crown on Charlemagne's head or attempting to do so. So the Pope, Leo, is giving to Charlemagne what Charlemagne is there to take. Charlemagne snatching the crown away from the Pope is very symbolic, because what it says to everyone gathered there is that Charlemagne doesn't need anyone to give him power. He can take it for himself. So the Pope proclaims Charlemagne king of the Romans. So Charlemagne adds northern and central Italy down to Rome as part of his empire. We should note that the southern part of Italy remains under the control of the Byzantine Empire. Of course, news is given to the Byzantine Empire that we now have a leader for all of Western Europe, politically and spiritually. The political leader is Charlemagne. The spiritual leader is the Roman Catholic Pope. In other words, essentially what Western Europe is telling the Byzantine Empire is that we are officially breaking away from you. We no longer require aid or advice from the Byzantine Empire. We're turning our back on you now. We have a political and a spiritual leader. Charlemagne's empire is called the Carolingian Empire, Christendom, or the Holy Roman Empire. Most people call it the Holy Roman Empire. Why these words, Holy Roman Empire? Well, essentially, what Charlemagne has done is he has brought together a large chunk of the old western half of the Roman Empire under his leadership. Of course, he does not have Spain. That belongs to the Muslims. He does not have England. That's not his. That at this point is under the control of 7 different kingdoms. So what he has is a small section of the old western half of the Roman Empire under his control, with an added element of Christianity. That's why we call it the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire signifies political unity. Everyone in Western Europe is under the political control of Charlemagne. Religious unity for Europe, in that everyone in Western Europe is under the control and influence of the Roman Catholic Church. Charlemagne's empire was so large that he could not oversee it by himself. So he reworked the political system that he had inherited. No more mayor of the palace, none of that. He promotes the counts. And there are about 600 counts at this point during Charlemagne's reign. And he takes these counts and he divides them and scatters them across his empire. And these divisions that were given to each count were called counties. That's where we get the word from. So there were over 600 counties in Charlemagne's empire. These 600 counties were managed by counts. What Charlemagne did was he rotated the counts. He did not allow a count to stay administrator of a particular county for too long because he did not want corruption to be a problem. He didn't want a count to have the ability, enough time to establish a system of favors. I'll do this for you if you do this for me kind of thing. He wanted to make sure that his counts were carrying out his orders, not trying to benefit from their position as counts. So he employed 2 men known only to him called Missi Dominici. These men, Missi Dominici meaning messengers of the Lord King, were spies. And what they did was they traveled throughout Charlemagne's empire, spying on, investigating, and making sure that the count stayed loyal. If a count was not loyal to Charlemagne, he lost his job as count, he lost his material possessions, and depending on how grave an offense he had committed against Charlemagne, he could have been imprisoned and executed for it. Charlemagne's empire did not last much after Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died, he left his empire to his son, Louis the Pious, who reigned from 814 to 840. Louis the Pious was almost like a do-nothing king. He was not interested in controlling this vast territory. He just wasn't cut out for it. So, around 840, Louis the Pious told his 3 sons, these would be the grandsons of Charlemagne, he says, look, I'm not interested in this. You guys can have this empire of your grandfather. You take it, you figure it out. These 3 grandsons of Charlemagne were Lothair, Charles, and Louis. These 3 sons of Louis the Pious, 3 grandsons of Charlemagne, fought each other for control of Charlemagne's empire. Add to this that during the reign of Louis the Pious, there were invasions by a group of people called the Magyars from Hungary in Eastern Europe, the Vikings from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the Muslims pushing up out of the south, out of Spain, into France. So you combine all of this together, and Charlemagne's empire was quickly disintegrating because of political turmoil among those 3 grandsons and from invasions from the outside. By 843, the 3 grandsons of Charlemagne had realized that none of them was strong enough to have the whole. So in 843, it was decided that Charlemagne's empire would be divided into 3 sections: the kingdom of Lothair, the kingdom of Charles the Bald, who actually had long flowing hair, and Louis the German. The Treaty of Verdun gave rise to a new political and social organization in Europe called feudalism, which will be our focus in upcoming chapters, but I'll just briefly mention it to you here. Feudalism was a political and social system of organization in which a powerful lord or king offered land and protection, of course in this period, protection from Magyars, Vikings, and Muslims in exchange for service and loyalty. So in each one of these 3 kingdoms of Lothair, Charles, and Louis, we have the development of what is called feudalism. So the way feudalism is supposed to work is that a king, like Lothair, Charles, or Louis, would offer land and protection to powerful men called lords, who would then serve him in his army. So the king protects the lords and all of society by arranging society into a military force for its own protection. So the king gives land and protection to the lords, who offer land and protection to a group of people called serfs. These are peasants, farmers, essentially agricultural slaves. They are not free men and women. They belong to the lords. So, in exchange, the serfs work the land for the lords give military service to the king. So, a few words to introduce here to you. The act of giving land by a king to a lord or a lord to a serf is called investiture. Land in the medieval period is called a fief or a benefice. In exchange for the fief or benefice, a lord would offer service, that is military service. This is called paying homage. In exchange for the land received from a lord, a serf would also have to pay service or homage. That would come in the form of working the land. All people in the feudal system are called vassals except for one. A vassal is a simple word that means servant. So, in the feudal system, everyone has to serve someone except for the king. The king is not a servant to anyone. So, on paper, the feudal system is supposed to look like this: king, lords, serfs. In reality, there were some lords that were richer than others and some serfs who were doing better than others. So in reality, we have what's called sub-infeudation, or sub-levels of lords and serfs. So in reality, the way the feudal system looked is you had a king who offered land, lots of land, to great lords. They're called great lords because they have lots of land and lots of money, who give to the king homage. They serve in his army. These great lords give some of their land away to lesser lords. These lesser lords are then bound to the great lords. They have to be knights for the great lords. The lesser lords give land to what's called simple knights. These simple knights become vassals to the lesser lords. They have to give these lesser lords military service. And then on down the line, the serfs were actually separated from a group of people simply called slaves. Slaves in this period were very rare, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with ethnicity. Christians in this period did not believe in slavery. They felt it was wrong for Christians to enslave other Christians. So slaves in this period were usually conquered non-Christian peoples. So serfs, though they were not freed, were not the same as slaves. Slaves could be bought and sold. They were treated as pieces of property. Serfs were at least recognized as human beings. They were not treated as pieces of property that could be bought and sold. And that ends our discussion of Europe in the early medieval period.